The mansion stood at the end of a long driveway lined with tall trees wrapped in golden lights. From outside, it looked like something from a dream. Expensive cars filled the parking area, and soft music floated through the open doors into the warm night air. Inside, crystal chandeliers shimmered above polished marble floors. Everything felt grand, planned, and perfectly arranged. The wealthy host moved through the crowd with confidence. He wore a tailored suit and a smile that seemed practiced. He enjoyed nights like this. Important people had gathered under his roof: business owners, investors, local influencers, and a few familiar faces from television. Conversations about deals and opportunities blended with light laughter. Glasses clinked gently. Waiters and waitresses moved quietly between guests, carrying trays filled with sparkling drinks and delicate appetizers. Among the staff was a young waitress who had only been working these events for a few months. She wore the same uniform as everyone else. Black dress, white apron, hair neatly tied back. Nothing about her appearance stood out in a room filled with designer gowns and expensive jewelry. Yet there was something calm about her. While others rushed nervously, she moved with steady steps, careful not to spill a single drop. She noticed everything. The way guests glanced at each other before laughing too loudly. The way some people smiled but never let their eyes soften. The way others checked their phones every few minutes, even in the middle of conversations. She had learned to read rooms quickly. It was part of the job. Stay quiet, stay polite, blend in. This was not her first event at the mansion, but tonight felt bigger. The decorations were more extravagant. A grand piano had been placed in the center of the main hall, its glossy surface reflecting the chandelier lights. It wasn't there for decoration alone. Earlier in the evening, a hired musician had played soft background melodies while guests arrived. Now the piano sat silent, almost waiting. The waitress passed by it several times while serving drinks. Each time, her eyes lingered for just a second longer than necessary. She quickly looked away whenever someone walked near her. No one noticed the small pause in her step. No one realized the quiet pull she felt every time she saw the black and white keys. Her shift had started hours earlier. She had arrived before sunset, helping set tables and polish glasses until they shone. While working, she overheard other staff whispering about the host's personality. They said he loved attention. They said he enjoyed surprising people. Sometimes in kind ways, sometimes not. He liked being the center of every story told about his parties. As the evening grew livelier, the host clapped his hands to gather attention. The music stopped. Conversations slowly faded into silence. He thanked everyone for coming and spoke proudly about his recent business success. The guests applauded. He raised his glass, making a short toast about ambition and hard work. The waitress stood near the back of the room, holding a tray. From where she stood, she could see the piano clearly. For a moment, she imagined what it would feel like to sit there. She quickly pushed the thought away. That world felt far from where she stood now. The host's eyes scanned the room as if searching for something new to entertain his guests. He noticed the piano again and smiled slightly. "It's a shame we don't have more music tonight," he said loudly, his voice carrying across the hall. Some guests nodded politely. Then his gaze shifted toward the staff. It landed on the young waitress standing near the wall. Maybe it was because she looked composed. Maybe it was simply random. But he pointed gently in her direction. "You there," he called out, his tone playful. "Do you know how to play?" For a second, she wasn't sure he was speaking to her. She glanced behind her. There was no one else. The tray in her hands suddenly felt heavier. Soft laughter rippled through the room. It wasn't cruel laughter, but it carried surprise. A few guests turned to look at her more closely now. She felt dozens of eyes studying her face, her uniform, her posture. She walked forward slowly, careful not to drop the tray. "Sir?" she asked politely. The host gestured toward the piano. "Can you play? Or should we assume it's not your hidden talent?" His words were light, meant to entertain. Some guests smiled wider, waiting for her answer. Her heart began to beat faster. She had learned to handle difficult customers before. She had handled rude comments and unfair demands. But this felt different. This wasn't a private conversation at a restaurant table. This was a room full of powerful people watching her. She could have laughed and said no. Most people would have expected that. It would have ended the moment quickly. She would have returned to serving drinks, and the story would fade into nothing. But something inside her stirred when she looked at the piano again. Memories surfaced quietly. Long afternoons in a small living room, fingers pressing keys until they ached. The soft voice of someone teaching her to feel the music instead of just play it. Those memories had never fully disappeared. The host tilted his head slightly. "Well?" he asked, still smiling. She swallowed and spoke softly but clearly. "Yes, sir. I can play." The laughter faded. A few eyebrows lifted in surprise. The host seemed amused. "Is that so?" he replied. "Then perhaps you should show us." Her co-workers stared at her, unsure of what would happen next. One of them gave her a worried look, almost warning her not to risk embarrassment. But she had already made her choice. She placed the tray carefully on a nearby table. Her hands felt cold. She wiped them gently against her apron before stepping toward the piano. Each step felt longer than the last. The room was silent now, filled with curiosity. As she approached the bench, she became aware of every small sound. The faint clink of glass, the soft rustle of fabric, the distant hum of air conditioning. The polished floor reflected her image back at her, reminding her of where she stood and who she appeared to be in that moment. Just a waitress at a wealthy man's party. She sat down slowly. The bench felt familiar despite the years that had passed since she last played in front of anyone. She placed her fingers lightly on the keys without pressing them yet. The smooth surface felt cool under her touch. For a brief second, doubt crept in. What if her hands trembled too much? What if she forgot the notes? What if the sound wasn't as beautiful as she remembered? The fear was real, but deeper than the fear was something stronger. A quiet longing that had waited patiently for a chance like this. She closed her eyes for just a moment, breathing in slowly. In that breath, the noise of the room seemed to fade away. It was no longer about the host or the guests or the laughter from earlier. It was about her and the piano. Across the hall, the host folded his arms, curious to see what would happen. The guests leaned slightly forward, eager for entertainment, perhaps even expecting an awkward attempt that would give them another story to share later. They did not know that the young woman sitting at the piano carried years of hidden practice in her fingertips. They did not know how many nights she had replayed melodies in her mind while clearing tables or washing dishes. They did not know how much of herself she had quietly set aside to survive. Her fingers hovered above the keys. Ready. The room held its breath. And in that stillness, just before the first note was about to be played, everything felt suspended between doubt and possibility.
For a few long seconds, she did not move. Her fingers rested lightly on the keys, but no sound came out. The silence in the room felt heavier than before. It was no longer playful or curious. It was tense. Some guests shifted in their places. A man near the front cleared his throat. Someone in the back whispered something under their breath. The wealthy host stood with a small smile still on his face, but now it looked slightly uncertain. He had expected either a quick refusal or a simple tune played with hesitation. He had not expected this stillness. She opened her eyes slowly and looked down at the keyboard. The black and white keys felt like old friends she had not seen in years. Her heart was racing so loudly she was sure the closest guests could hear it. Her palms felt damp, and she pressed her fingers gently against her dress before placing them back on the keys. She told herself one thing: just begin. The first note came out soft, almost fragile. It floated through the hall like a question. Then another note followed, and another. The melody started simple, slow, careful. It was not loud or dramatic. It did not try to impress anyone right away. It simply existed, steady and calm. The sound echoed lightly against the high ceilings and glass walls. The guests leaned in slightly. Some still wore polite smiles, waiting to see if this would turn into something awkward. A few of them exchanged glances, unsure whether to take it seriously yet. But she did not look at them. She kept her eyes on the keys. As her fingers began to move more freely, something inside her shifted. The trembling in her hands slowly disappeared. Muscle memory returned, quiet and dependable. The melody grew stronger, more confident. What started as a soft introduction began to unfold into something deeper. Her shoulders relaxed. Her back straightened. The nervous waitress who had been holding a tray just minutes earlier began to fade away. In her place sat someone else, someone who knew exactly what she was doing. The sound changed. It carried emotion now. It was no longer just notes pressed in order. It felt like a story being told without words. Near the center of the room, a woman who had been checking her phone lowered it slowly. A man who had been whispering to his colleagues stopped mid-sentence. Even the servers standing near the walls forgot about their duties for a moment. Every ear in the room turned toward the piano. The wealthy host uncrossed his arms. His smile disappeared completely. His expression shifted into something closer to focus. Her left hand moved with steady rhythm, creating a foundation that filled the room with warmth. Her right hand danced lightly over higher notes, weaving a melody that felt both gentle and powerful at the same time. The sound rose and fell like quiet waves. She was no longer thinking about who was watching. She was no longer worried about making a mistake. The music had taken over the space where fear had been. Memories began to surface in her mind as she played. She remembered sitting at an old piano that had slightly chipped keys. She remembered practicing while others slept. She remembered being told once that she had something special, something rare, but life had other plans. There had been bills to pay, responsibilities to carry, dreams that had to be folded neatly and placed away for later. But right now, later had arrived. The melody grew more complex. Her fingers moved faster, but never rushed. Every note felt intentional. Every pause felt meaningful. There was strength in the quiet moments between phrases. A guest near the front slowly placed his glass down on a nearby table, afraid that even the soft clink might disturb the sound. Another guest folded her hands together tightly, her eyes fixed on the pianist. The room that had once been filled with casual chatter now felt like a concert hall. She leaned slightly into the keys, allowing the music to swell. The volume increased, but it was never overwhelming. It wrapped around the room like a warm current, pulling everyone into its center. The wealthy host shifted his weight from one foot to the other. There was something in his expression now that had not been there before. It was no longer amusement. It was realization. This was not a joke. The piece moved into a new section, more emotional than before. The notes carried longing, struggle, hope. Even those who knew nothing about music could feel it. It touched something human inside them. One of the older guests closed his eyes briefly, listening closely. Another pressed her hand lightly against her chest, as if steadying her breath. The waitress, though she no longer seemed like one, allowed herself to fully enter the music. Her face reflected the emotions of the piece. At times her expression softened. At other moments, it grew intense, almost fierce. It was as if years of silence were being released through her hands. Her co-workers watched from the side of the room in disbelief. They had seen her carry heavy trays and wipe down tables. They had shared short breaks and simple conversations. None of them had known this side of her. The melody softened again, returning briefly to the gentle theme from the beginning. But now it sounded different, fuller, richer, transformed by everything that had come in between. The silence in the room was no longer tense. It was respectful. The wealthy host slowly walked a few steps closer to the piano, careful not to interrupt. His earlier confidence had been replaced by something quieter. He was no longer the center of attention. He knew it. As she approached the final section of the piece, her hands moved with a new kind of power. The notes rose higher, building towards something strong and undeniable. The rhythm grew bold. The melody expanded. It felt like a statement. Her fingers struck the final series of notes with clarity and strength. The last chord rang out, filling every corner of the hall. It lingered in the air for a long second before slowly fading away. And then there was silence. Not awkward silence. Not confused silence. A deep, stunned silence. No one moved. No one spoke. It was as if the room needed a moment to understand what had just happened. She kept her hands resting lightly on the keys, her breathing steady but heavy from the emotional weight of the performance. Slowly, she lifted her fingers away and let them rest in her lap. She did not immediately look up. For a brief second, doubt tried to return. Was it good enough? Had she imagined the impact? Then she heard it. A single clap. It came from somewhere near the front. Then another followed. And another. Within seconds, the entire room erupted into applause. It was not polite clapping. It was loud, genuine, and full of surprise. Some guests even stood to their feet. The sound of their hands coming together echoed through the hall almost as powerfully as the music had. She finally looked up. The faces staring back at her were no longer amused or curious. They were amazed. The wealthy host stood directly in front of the piano now. He was clapping too, slower than the others, his expression thoughtful. There was humility in his eyes, something that had not been there at the beginning of the night. She stood up slowly from the bench, unsure of what to do next. Applause continued to fill the room. A few guests exchanged words like incredible and unbelievable. Her coworkers smiled widely, pride replacing their earlier worry. For the first time that evening, she did not feel invisible. The grand hall, the chandeliers, the expensive suits, none of it seemed as overwhelming as before. She stood there not as a waitress being teased, but as a musician who had just reminded everyone of the power of hidden talent. The wealthy host stepped closer, lowering his hands as the applause slowly began to fade. And in that moment, the balance in the room had quietly shifted. The applause did not fade quickly. It rolled through the hall in waves, growing louder instead of softer. A few guests stood up fully now, clapping above their shoulders. Others shook their heads in disbelief, smiling as if they had just witnessed something rare. She stood beside the piano, unsure where to look. Her cheeks felt warm, and her hands were still slightly trembling, though not from fear anymore. It was the release of everything she had held inside for years. The wealthy host stepped closer until he stood just a few feet away from her. Up close, his expression looked different than before. The playful edge was gone. In its place was something more thoughtful. "I did not expect that," he admitted, loud enough for those nearby to hear. A few guests laughed softly, but this time the laughter carried respect, not mockery. She lowered her gaze for a moment. "Thank you for the chance," she said quietly. It was a simple sentence, but it carried weight. She had not been asking for a stage. She had not been looking for attention. The opportunity had come unexpectedly, and she had taken it. The host nodded slowly. "Where did you learn to play like that?" he asked. The room grew attentive again, though not as silent as during the performance. Guests leaned in, curious about the story behind the talent. She hesitated. Talking about her past felt more vulnerable than playing the piano. Music allowed her to hide behind sound. Words did not. "I learned years ago," she replied gently. "I practiced a lot." Some of the guests smiled at her modest answer, but the host seemed to sense that there was more behind it. "You don't just practice a little and play like that," he said, shaking his head slightly. "That takes years." She met his eyes briefly, then looked away again. "Yes," she said softly. "It does." The applause slowly turned into small conversations. Guests began speaking excitedly about the performance. A few of them approached the piano, standing nearby as if it had become something special. It was no longer just a decoration in the hall. It had become the heart of the evening. Her coworkers stood near the wall, whispering to each other. One of them gave her a wide smile and a small thumbs up. She felt a warmth in her chest, seeing their support. The host turned toward the guests and raised his voice slightly. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said, "I believe we have discovered the real highlight of tonight." More applause followed. She felt a mix of pride and discomfort. Part of her wanted to disappear back into the background. Another part of her wanted to hold on to this moment for as long as possible. A woman dressed in an elegant gown stepped forward. "That was beautiful," she said sincerely. It felt honest. Honest. The words stayed in her mind. Do you perform somewhere? The woman asked. She shook her head. No. Why not? The woman pressed gently. She didn't know how to answer that without explaining everything. The responsibilities, the sacrifices, the way life had slowly pulled her away from the world of music. So she simply said, life took me in a different direction. The woman nodded as if she understood more than what was spoken. Across the room, a man who had remained quiet during most of the evening approached the host. He leaned in and spoke softly. The host listened carefully, his eyes occasionally glancing back toward her. She noticed but tried not to overthink it. A few more guests gathered around her now. They asked small questions. What piece had she played? How long had she been learning? Did she still practice? She answered honestly but briefly. She did not want the attention to feel like a spotlight burning too brightly. One older guest stepped closer and said, "You reminded me of why I fell in love with music in the first place." His voice carried emotion. It's not about perfection. It's about feeling. Her throat tightened slightly at his words. That had always been her belief, too. The wealthy host raised his hand again, signaling for attention. The room quieted once more, though this silence felt different from the earlier one. It was filled with admiration instead of doubt. "I owe you an apology," he said, turning toward her directly. His tone was clear and steady. "When I asked you to play, I thought it would be light entertainment. I did not expect to be moved." A soft murmur passed through the crowd. She shook her head quickly. "There's nothing to apologize for," she replied. But he continued, "No, there is. I underestimated you." The honesty in his voice surprised many of the guests. It surprised her too. He looked around at the audience. "Tonight was meant to celebrate success," he said. "But I think we just witnessed something more meaningful than any business deal." The guests nodded, some clapping lightly in agreement. She felt overwhelmed again, but this time in a different way. It was not just about proving herself. It was about being seen. The man who had spoken quietly to the host earlier now stepped forward. He introduced himself as someone involved in organizing cultural events in the city. He explained that he worked with musicians and helped arrange performances for local gatherings. "We are always searching for authentic talent," he said. "Would you ever consider performing publicly?" Her breath caught for a moment. The question felt unreal. Perform publicly? She had once dreamed of that. She had imagined bright lights, focused audiences, and the feeling of sharing music freely. But those dreams had slowly faded under the weight of responsibility. "I don't know," she admitted honestly. The man smiled kindly. "Think about it," he said. "Talent like yours shouldn't stay hidden." Hidden. That word echoed inside her. For years, she had hidden this part of herself without even realizing it. Not because she was ashamed, but because survival had required her to focus on other things. The host turned to her again. "If you are willing," he said carefully, "I would be honored to host another event, this time featuring you properly." A small gasp moved through the crowd. She looked at him, trying to understand if he truly meant it. "I don't say that lightly," he added. "You changed the atmosphere in this room. That is not something everyone can do." Her mind felt full of noise, thoughts racing in every direction. Could she step back into that world? Could she balance everything? Was this just excitement from the moment, or something real? One of her co-workers gently touched her arm from behind, whispering, "You deserve this." She swallowed hard. The applause began again, softer but steady. It felt like encouragement rather than celebration. The wealthy host extended his hand toward her, not as someone challenging a waitress, but as someone acknowledging an artist. She hesitated only briefly before shaking his hand. In that simple gesture, the distance between them seemed to shrink. Around them, the guests resumed conversations, but the tone had changed completely. The party no longer revolved around status or wealth. It revolved around the performance that had surprised everyone. The piano still stood in the center of the hall, but now it felt alive. She stepped back slightly, allowing space to breathe. Her shift was technically not over. There were still trays to carry and tables to clear. But something inside her had shifted permanently. As she walked back toward the side of the room, a few guests stopped her again to offer kind words. None of them looked at her the same way they had before. She picked up a tray once more, but it felt lighter somehow. The wealthy host watched her quietly from across the hall. He seemed deep in thought. The night continued, but the mood remained transformed. Laughter returned, music played softly from speakers again, and conversations flowed. Yet there was a new layer beneath it all, respect. She moved through the crowd with calm steps, but inside her, something had awakened. For years, she had believed that part of her life was over, that the world of music belonged to a different version of herself. But tonight had proven something else. Sometimes talent waits. Sometimes it hides in plain sight. And sometimes, all it needs is one unexpected moment to step back into the light. Long after the applause faded, and the guests slowly returned to their conversations, her mind was still at the piano. She moved through the room with a tray in her hands, but she no longer felt like she was simply working another shift. Something had changed, and she could feel it in the way people looked at her. Earlier that evening, she had been invisible. Now, guests smiled at her when she passed by. A few even thanked her again, as if the performance had been a personal gift. The wealthy host remained thoughtful for the rest of the night. He still spoke with his guests, still laughed at certain moments, but there was a difference in his tone. He glanced at the piano more than once, almost replaying the music in his mind. When the event finally came to an end, and the last of the cars disappeared down the long driveway, the mansion grew quiet. The lights dimmed. Staff members began clearing tables and stacking chairs. The elegant evening slowly turned back into ordinary cleanup. She helped fold tablecloths and collect empty glasses. Her body felt tired, but her heart felt awake. One of her coworkers approached her near the kitchen entrance. "You never told us you could play like that," she said, half amazed, half teasing. She gave a small smile. "It just never came up." "That wasn't just playing," the coworker replied. "That was something else." She didn't answer right away. She didn't quite know how to describe it herself. It had felt like stepping back into a part of her life she thought she had left behind. As she changed out of her uniform later that night, she caught her reflection in the mirror. For a moment, she did not see a waitress. She saw the young girl who used to sit at a piano every afternoon, practicing until her fingers ached. That girl had big dreams. She grew up in a small apartment where space was limited, but music filled every corner. The piano she learned on was old and slightly out of tune, but she loved it as if it were new. Her teacher had once told her that talent was a gift, but discipline was a choice. She chose discipline. While other children played outside, she practiced scales. While others slept in on weekends, she woke early to rehearse pieces over and over again. It was not forced on her. She loved the feeling of improving, of mastering something difficult. There had been small local competitions, small performances in community halls. Nothing grand, nothing glamorous. But every time she sat down to play, she felt at home. Then life changed. Responsibilities came suddenly and heavily. Financial pressure grew. Dreams that once seemed close began to feel distant. The cost of lessons became difficult to manage. The time needed for practice was replaced by work hours. She remembered the day she packed away her sheet music. She told herself it was temporary, just until things got better. But temporary turned into years. Working as a waitress was never meant to replace music. It was meant to support survival. She learned to carry plates carefully, to smile even when tired, to stay calm in stressful moments. She became strong in different ways. Still, every time she heard a piano somewhere, in a hotel lobby, in a movie, at a wedding, something inside her tightened. It was not regret exactly. It was longing. That night at the mansion, when the host had pointed at her and asked if she could play, that longing had rushed back all at once. The next morning, she woke earlier than usual. She lay in bed staring at the ceiling, replaying every second of the performance in her mind. The applause. The silence before it. The look on the host's face when he realized she was serious. Part of her worried it had all been a dream. But then her phone buzzed. It was a message from one of her coworkers. A short video clip had been recorded during the performance. Someone had shared it in their group chat. The video was slightly shaky, but the music was clear. She pressed play. Hearing herself from the outside felt strange. The sound was strong, confident. It didn't sound like someone who had stepped away from music for years. She felt tears gather in her eyes, not from sadness, but from realization. Later that day, another message came, this time from an unknown number. It was the event organizer who had spoken to her at the party. He reminded her about their brief conversation and asked if she would be willing to meet for coffee sometime to discuss potential opportunities. Her heart skipped. Opportunities. The word felt both exciting and frightening. She spent the rest of the day thinking, could she really return to music? Could she balance work and practice? Would she disappoint people if she tried and failed? Doubt whispered in her mind, but so did hope. That evening, she found herself walking past a small music shop near her neighborhood. She had passed it many times before, without going inside. This time, she paused. Through the window, she saw a simple upright piano displayed near the back of the store. Her reflection overlapped with the instrument in the glass. Without overthinking, she pushed the door open. The soft smell of wood and paper greeted her. A gentle melody played quietly from speakers inside. The shop owner looked up and smiled. "Can I help you?" he asked kindly. She hesitated, then said, "Do you allow people to try the piano?" "Of course," he replied. She walked slowly toward it, her heart beating steadily. Sitting down felt familiar, like returning to a place she belonged. She placed her hands on the keys and began to play softly. The sound was not as powerful as the grand piano from the mansion, but it didn't matter. The feeling was the same. As she played, she realized something important. Music had never left her. She had left it, and now she had a choice. When she finished, the shop owner nodded in appreciation. "You play beautifully," he said. She smiled shyly. "Thank you. I used to practice a lot." "Used to?" he asked gently. She paused. "Maybe I will again," she replied. Walking home that evening, the sky painted in soft shades of orange and pink, she felt lighter. Not because everything was solved, not because her future was suddenly clear, but because a door that had once seemed closed was now open again. Back at the mansion, the wealthy host also thought about that night. He replayed the moment he had called her out playfully, expecting amusement. He replayed the silence that followed the first note. He replayed the way the room had transformed. He realized that sometimes talent appears in unexpected places, and sometimes pride can blind a person from seeing it. He made a quiet decision to reach out again soon. Meanwhile, she sat at home with her old sheet music spread across the table. Some pages were slightly worn, edges bent from years of use. She traced her fingers over the notes, remembering how each piece felt under her hands. The performance at the mansion had not just surprised the guests. It had awakened her, and deep down, she knew that this was only the beginning of something she had once believed was over. The days after the party did not return to normal the way she expected. Something small but powerful had shifted, and it followed her everywhere. At work, people treated her differently. Not in a dramatic way, but in subtle ones. A few regular clients who had attended the event recognized her and brought it up with warm smiles. "You're the one who played that night, right?" they would ask. She would nod politely, still not fully used to hearing herself described that way. Her coworkers spoke about the performance during their breaks. Some of them had shown the short video clip to friends and family. Word was spreading quietly, not in a loud viral explosion, but in a steady ripple. One afternoon, her phone rang again. It was the wealthy host. She hesitated before answering. She did not know what to expect. His voice sounded calmer than it had at the party. Less dramatic, more sincere. "I've been thinking about that night," he said. "And I would like to invite you to perform at another event I'm hosting next month. This time, not as a surprise, as the featured musician." Her breath caught for a moment. "Featured?" she repeated softly. "Yes," he replied. "Proper introduction. Proper stage setup. Guests who are there to listen." The idea both thrilled and frightened her. She thanked him and told him she would think about it. After hanging up, she sat quietly for a long time. The opportunity felt real now. Not just a conversation at a party. Not just applause that fades by morning. A full performance. The event organizer who had contacted her earlier also followed up. He suggested meeting to discuss possible smaller concerts in local cultural spaces. He explained that audiences were often looking for authentic talent, musicians who played with heart. Heart. She thought about the older guest who had used that same word. She knew she needed to practice seriously again. Playing once at a party was different from preparing for a proper performance. She could not rely only on old memory. So she created a simple routine. After work, instead of going straight home to rest, she began visiting the small music shop again. The owner, seeing her dedication, allowed her extra time on the piano when the store was quiet. Sometimes she practiced for an hour, sometimes longer. The first few sessions were humbling. Her fingers were strong, but her endurance had faded. Some passages that once felt easy now required focus and repetition. She made small mistakes. She corrected them. She repeated difficult sections over and over again until they flowed smoothly. There were moments of frustration. She would stop mid-piece and press her hands against her face, wondering if she had waited too long to return. But then there were moments of pure joy, when a melody came together perfectly, when her hands moved without hesitation, when the sound filled the small shop and made her forget everything else. The shop owner sometimes paused his work just to listen. "You're improving every day," he said one evening. She smiled. "I'm remembering," she replied. Meanwhile, the wealthy host began planning the next event differently. He instructed his team to place the piano at the center of the room intentionally, not as decoration but as the focus. He adjusted the lighting plans. Softer lights around the audience. A gentle spotlight over the instrument. He also sent out invitations that included a special note: live piano performance. Guests who had attended the previous party responded quickly. Many of them were curious. Some had spoken about her performance for weeks. Others had told friends about the surprising moment when a waitress transformed the entire atmosphere of the room. As the event date approached, she felt both excitement and pressure. This time, there would be no element of surprise to protect her. People would arrive expecting something extraordinary. One evening, after a long practice session, she sat alone at the piano in the quiet shop. The sun had already set, and the street outside was calm. She let her hands rest on the keys, without playing. She thought about why she loved music in the first place. It had never been about applause. It had never been about recognition. It had been about expression. About saying things without words. If she focused on that, she knew she would be fine. The night of the new event arrived. This time, she did not enter the mansion through the staff entrance. She arrived through the front doors. She wore a simple but elegant dress she had chosen carefully. Nothing flashy, nothing dramatic. Just something that felt like her. The wealthy host greeted her personally at the entrance. His tone carried respect. "I'm glad you agreed," he said. "So am I," she replied honestly. The hall looked different from before. The piano stood proudly under soft lighting. Chairs were arranged in a semicircle facing it. The setup felt intentional, almost intimate. Guests filled the room gradually. The atmosphere was calm, curious, and expectant. When the time came, the host stepped forward and addressed the audience. "Last month," he began, "I witnessed something that reminded me how easy it is to overlook talent. Tonight, we are not overlooking anything." He turned toward her and gestured for her to step forward. She walked toward the piano slowly, feeling dozens of eyes on her again. But this time, the energy felt supportive rather than skeptical. She sat down and adjusted the bench slightly. The room grew quiet. Before placing her hands on the keys, she looked up briefly at the audience. She did not see wealthy investors or powerful figures. She saw people. Curious faces. Open expressions. She began to play. The first notes were steady and confident. She had chosen a piece that allowed both softness and strength. The melody unfolded naturally, flowing from her hands like it had been waiting for this moment. There was no nervous pause this time. As she continued, she felt something even deeper than before. Not just relief or pride, but belonging. The music filled the hall gently at first, then more fully. The audience listened closely. Some closed their eyes. Some leaned forward. The wealthy host stood near the side, watching quietly. There was no playful smile on his face now, only admiration. When she reached the final section of the piece, she allowed herself to fully express the emotion she had carried for years, the struggle, the pause, the return, the hope. The final chord rang out clearly. Silence followed for a second. Then applause rose again, stronger than before. Not because it was unexpected, but because it was deserved. She stood slowly, her heart steady. She bowed her head slightly in gratitude. In that moment, she was no longer defined by the uniform she once wore at the party. She was defined by the music she carried within her. And as the applause continued, she realized that the transformation had not only changed how others saw her, it had changed how she saw herself. The applause that night felt different from the first time. The first time had been filled with surprise. This time, it was filled with certainty. The guests were not clapping because they were shocked that a waitress could play. They were clapping because they had just experienced something meaningful. She stood near the piano for a moment, letting the sound of the applause settle into her heart. She did not rush away from it. She allowed herself to feel it fully. Years ago, she would have imagined this kind of moment. Now she was living it. When the clapping slowly softened, several guests approached her again. But the conversations were deeper now. They asked about her musical influences, about her plans, about what kind of pieces she loved to play most. They spoke to her as an artist. The wealthy host stepped forward once more. There was no dramatic speech this time. Just a few simple words. "Thank you," he said sincerely. "You reminded all of us tonight that talent deserves space." She smiled. "Thank you for giving it space." He nodded, understanding the weight of that sentence. Later that evening, the event organizer who had first contacted her confirmed a small public performance at a local cultural hall. It was not a huge venue, but it was respected. Tickets would be limited. The audience would be there specifically to listen. She agreed. The following weeks became a mix of hard work and quiet reflection. She continued her job for the time being, balancing shifts with practice. But her mindset had changed. She was no longer working only to survive. She was working while building something new. Practice became part of her daily rhythm. She woke earlier to stretch her fingers and run through scales. She stayed late at the music shop to refine difficult sections. She recorded herself sometimes, listening carefully for areas that needed improvement. There were days when exhaustion crept in. Doubt still appeared occasionally, whispering that maybe the excitement would fade, that maybe she had reached her peak already. But each time she sat at the piano, the doubt grew quieter. The public performance arrived faster than she expected. The hall was modest but beautiful, with warm wooden floors and simple lighting. The chairs were arranged neatly in rows. A small stage held a well-polished grand piano. She arrived early, wanting time alone with the instrument. When she pressed the first few keys during rehearsal, the sound echoed gently through the empty room. It felt intimate. As people began filling the seats later that evening, she felt nerves again, but this time they felt healthy. The kind that sharpen focus rather than weaken it. She walked onto the stage to soft applause. No one in the audience knew her story fully. Some had heard about the mansion performance. Others had simply seen her name on the event listing. She sat down and took a steady breath. Then she began. The first piece was soft and reflective. The notes moved gently, drawing the audience inward. The hall became quiet quickly. The sound of her playing seemed to wrap around every listener. With each piece, her confidence grew stronger. She allowed herself to explore deeper emotions: hope, struggle, resilience, gratitude. She was no longer playing to prove anything. She was playing to share something. Midway through the performance, she looked up briefly and saw faces completely focused on her music. No one was distracted. No one was checking phones. They were present. The final piece of the night carried special meaning. It was one she had learned years ago but had not played in public since her younger days. As her fingers moved across the keys, she felt as if she were reconnecting with her past self, the girl who once dreamed freely. The final chord rang out strong and clear. The audience stood to their feet. The standing ovation felt like a wave of warmth washing over her. She bowed her head slightly, overwhelmed but steady. After the concert, people lined up to thank her personally. Some shared how the music had reminded them of their own forgotten passions. Others spoke about how they had nearly given up on creative dreams but felt inspired again. One woman said softly, "You made me remember something I had hidden inside." Those words stayed with her long after the hall emptied. As her performances slowly became more frequent, she made an important decision. She reduced her shifts at work, choosing to focus more on music. It was not an easy choice. Stability felt safe. Change felt uncertain. But she realized something important. Security without fulfillment had once left her feeling invisible. Now she wanted balance. The wealthy host attended one of her public performances quietly, sitting in the back row. He did not announce himself. He simply listened. After the concert, he approached her briefly. "You've grown even stronger," he said. She smiled. "So have you." He understood what she meant. That first playful challenge had transformed both of them in unexpected ways. It had reminded him to look beyond appearances. It had reminded her to step forward instead of staying hidden. Months later, she was no longer introduced as the waitress who shocked everyone. She was introduced simply as a pianist. Her journey was not overnight success. It was steady, honest progress. Small concerts turned into larger invitations. She continued practicing with discipline. She continued learning new pieces. She continued staying humble. At times, she would think back to that first night at the mansion, the laughter, the hesitation, the silence before the first note. She realized that moment had not been about proving others wrong. It had been about reclaiming herself. One evening, after a successful performance in another city, she sat alone at the piano after the audience had left. The hall was quiet, just like the mansion had been after the party ended months ago. She pressed a few soft keys and let the melody drift into the empty space. She thought about how easily talent can be overlooked, not only by others, but by the person who carries it. Life can push dreams aside. Responsibilities can grow heavy. Time can pass quickly. But sometimes, all it takes is one unexpected moment to bring everything back to life. She no longer waited for someone to dare her. She no longer needed permission to play. She had found her place again, not because someone handed it to her, but because she stepped into it. And in that quiet hall, with the final notes fading gently into the air, she understood something clearly. Hidden talent does not disappear. It waits. And when given the chance, it can change everything.